Crimea, that strategic jewel that Putin marketed to the world in 2014 as reclaimed homeland territory, and to the Russian people as an oasis of stability and prosperity. Today, that jewel lies shattered. That promise died in a dry riverbed. The shocking news, which Ukrainian media reported as a historic disaster, has ignited a fuse of chaos. For the first time since 1971, that is, for the first time in 54 years, the bed of the Belbek River, the main water source feeding Sevastopol, Crimea's second-largest city, has completely dried up. This is officially a death sentence for Crimea. The soil is cracked, the riverbed is dusty, the once life-giving vein is now lifeless. But this is only the beginning. This is merely the first and most symbolic wave of the perfect storm hitting Crimea. At the same time, the international news agency Reuters confirmed the second disaster shaking the peninsula: rationing and price freezes due to fuel shortages. At least 50% of Crimea's gas stations are closed. The pumps are locked. Signs reading "No gasoline" are posted. Miles-long queues, fighting drivers, jerry cans sold at exorbitant prices on the black market. This is not a shortage. This is a logistical paralysis. So, how did this chain of disasters that brought Crimea to the brink of total collapse begin? We must not fall for the flimsy excuses of Kremlin-appointed officials and the Kremlin itself, such as climate change or temporary technical problems. The root of this crisis lies not in the weather, but in the Kremlin's strategic bankruptcy, particularly in a single K moment of destiny. In June 2023, the massive concrete walls of the Russian-controlled Kakhovka Dam on the Dnieper River were blown up. This event was not just an instant humanitarian disaster that flooded southern Ukraine. It was a strategic, self-inflicted wound that permanently darkened Crimea's future. The massive reservoir created by the Kakhovka Dam was the sole source feeding the North Crimean Canal, the lifeblood of the Crimean Peninsula. This canal, an engineering marvel built during the Soviet era, single-handedly met a full 85% of Crimea's freshwater needs. Agriculture, industry, and drinking water were all dependent on this canal. The moment the dam collapsed, the massive reservoir emptied, and the flow of water to the North Crimean Canal was permanently cut off. This was not simply closing a valve. It was like permanently altering the course of a river. This is where Putin's strategic self-defeating move comes into play. The Belbek River, which Ukrainian media reports say has dried up for the first time since 1971, is just the latest and most visible victim of this permanent disaster. Belbek was one of Crimea's own internal sources, but the peninsula's overall water balance has been so disrupted that even its own rivers are drying up. Groundwater levels are falling at an alarming rate. Ponds and small reservoirs are evaporating. The panic statements of the occupying authorities, claiming that alarm bells are ringing, cannot hide the gravity of the situation. The water problem that Putin thought he solved with military force in 2022 has now returned as a much bigger, much more permanent, and almost impossible to solve ecological and humanitarian disaster. The ghost of Kakhovka hovers over Crimea, revealing itself in every cracked piece of soil, every empty tap. This is not nature's revenge. It is the inevitable consequence of strategic blindness and ruthlessness. This scene is not just an infrastructure crisis, but also a deep psychological breakdown. The people of Crimea, who for 10 years were subjected to Kremlin propaganda's lie that life is better with Russia, are now crushed under the rubble of that lie. The Russian settlers who flocked to the peninsula after 2014 are realizing that the safe harbor promised to them was actually a trap. Every drop of water that doesn't flow from the tap, every gas pump that doesn't work, is another page torn from Putin's social contract. The promise of stability has given way to chaos. To fully understand Crimea's current nightmare, we must go back in time and piece together the milestones of this peninsula's tragic recent history, filled with water, blood, and lies. This is the story of a decade of betrayal and strategic bankruptcy. In March 2014, when Putin's little green men took control of Crimea and annexed it through an illegal referendum, Ukraine's first and strongest retaliation was not military, but hydraulic. Kiev shut off the valves of the North Crimean Canal, the lifeblood of Crimea. In an instant, 85% of the peninsula's water was gone. This marked the beginning of an agonizing drought struggle for Crimea that would last 8 years, crippling agriculture, disrupting industry, and forcing the population into water conservation. During this period, the Kremlin spent billions of rubles trying to drill new wells, lay pipelines, and even fantasized about transporting water from mainland Russia. But none of these efforts could replace the canal. The water problem became the Achilles heel of the annexation. In February 2022, when the Russian army launched a full-scale attack on Ukraine, one of the first targets was the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant on the Dnieper River and the starting point of the North Crimean Canal. Russian paratroopers and armored units quickly seized the area and, in their euphoria of victory, opened the canal's valves. The Kremlin declared this a major strategic victory, claiming that Putin had kept his promise to the people of Crimea and permanently solved the peninsula's water problem. The propaganda machine broadcast images of water returning to Crimea for days. However, this victory was actually sowing the seeds of its own disaster. In June 2023, when Ukraine's counteroffensive gained momentum in the south and Russian lines were threatened, the Kremlin panicked. On the morning of June 6, 2023, the massive concrete walls of the Kakhovka Dam were blown up with explosives placed inside. This was both a war crime and an incomprehensible strategic act of self-destruction. The flood disaster caused by the dam's destruction displaced tens of thousands of people. But the real, lasting damage came from the emptying of the dam's massive reservoir. The source feeding the North Crimean Canal dried up. The flow of water to Crimea was permanently cut off, not by closing the valves this time, but by destroying the source itself. Putin's strategic victory 16 months earlier had given way to an irreparable disaster. By September 2025, as the war dragged on and Ukraine's attacks on Russian logistics lines in Crimea, such as bridges, railways, and fuel depots, intensified, a new crisis emerged on the peninsula: fuel shortages. On September 29th, the international news agency Reuters announced the situation to the world. Crimea freezes fuel prices amid ongoing shortages, introduces rationing. This was an official admission that the crisis had reached uncontrollable proportions and that the occupation administration had lost control. Even Russian newspapers like Kommersant reported that at least half of the stations were closed. This situation directly affects military logistics as well as the civilian population. There is no diesel or gasoline to move tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery units, and, most importantly, the logistics trucks that carry ammunition to the front. Ukraine's precision strikes in recent weeks on the Feodosia refinery and strategic depots such as Gvardeyskoye have reduced the Russian army's fuel reserves in Crimea to below critical levels. This effectively means that the supply lines for Russian troops on the southern front have been cut. Tanks cannot advance without fuel. When trucks run out of fuel, they cannot transport ammunition. This is a strangulation move that leaves the Russian military presence in Crimea so helpless that it cannot even move into a defensive position. These two shocking developments clearly show how Putin's promise of stability and prosperity in Crimea has evaporated and collapsed. In Crimea, it is not just the rivers that are drying up. Hopes are drying up too. The taps are dry, the tanks are empty, the soil is cracked, the people are hopeless and angry. 2.5 million civilians and more than 60,000 Russian soldiers crammed onto the peninsula suddenly find themselves without water or fuel, in the midst of a primitive struggle for survival in the middle of the modern world. The ripple effect of this perfect storm in Crimea not only turns the daily life of civilians into hell, but also strangles the Russian army, which uses the peninsula as a massive military base from two fronts. This is a brutal logistical nightmare, resulting not from a direct military operation by Ukraine, but from a combination of Russia's own strategic mistakes and Ukraine's indirect logistical attacks. In addition to the military paralysis caused by this double stranglehold, the death of the peninsula's economy has also become inevitable. Crimea's tourism sector, once a popular destination for Russian tourists, has gone bankrupt. The peninsula, which welcomed 9 million tourists annually before the war, has seen tourist numbers drop below 500,000 this year. Hotels are empty, restaurants are closed, and tourism workers are unemployed. The agricultural sector, especially Crimea's famous vineyards and orchards, is drying up due to drought. Agriculture cannot be carried out without the North Crimean Canal. The logistics sector is stopped due to fuel shortages. Companies are going bankrupt, supply chains have been severed. In short, the economic development Putin promised after the annexation has given way to a total collapse. This is not just a military defeat, but also an economic disaster. When we examine the anatomy of this multi-layered crisis in Crimea, what emerges is not just an infrastructure or logistics problem, but also a deepening risk of social explosion and a ruthless game of strategic chess played by the administration with its own people. The final and most ruthless move in this game was documented in a shocking report published by the Ukrainian National Resistance Center, or CNS, in early October. This report lays bare the extent of the economic misery in Crimea. Average salaries on the peninsula have fallen below the Russian Federation's own official minimum living standard. According to the CNS, salaries in many sectors have fallen to 15,000 rubles per month, or about $150. This amount is far from enough to cover basic food and housing needs, let alone cope with exorbitant prices under wartime conditions. This equation of misery is dangerously deepening social fault lines on the peninsula. On one side, there is a privileged Russian elite class that settled in the region after the annexation and still receives support from Moscow in some way. On the other side, millions of people, both native Ukrainians and those who came from other regions of Russia but are now left to their fate, are literally struggling to survive. The taps are dry, gas stations are closed, supermarket shelves are empty, and their salaries are below the poverty line. This situation fuels a dangerous perception among the people. There is gas for the regime but not for the people. Because despite all this scarcity, military convoys are still somehow moving, and Russian officials' luxury vehicles have full tanks. This perception, combined with the reality that the Kremlin has abandoned the Crimean people to their fate, viewing them merely as pawns for a military base, is bringing the accumulated anger to a boiling point. And the first signs of this explosion are beginning to appear on the streets. Local sources and social media posts report increasing tension among people, fights, and even small-scale looting incidents. One of the most striking examples is people starting to steal gasoline from parked cars at night. This is not just a case of theft. It is a sign that social order is beginning to unravel, that people are forced to resort to illegal means to meet their basic needs. It is the first spark of uncontrolled chaos, the social explosion that is the Kremlin's worst nightmare. The Kremlin's response to this situation is, as always, to increase pressure and blame others. But this time, they have no magic wand to solve the water or fuel problem. The destruction of Kakhovka is irreversible. Logistics routes are under constant threat from Ukraine. Putin has exhausted all possible moves on his Crimean chessboard. Like a player who has destroyed his own castle with his own hand, he can now only wait helplessly for his king to fall. This total collapse in Crimea is not just a water or fuel crisis. It is the greatest betrayal of the Crimean people by Vladimir Putin's Russian world ideology, which he has been building for over 20 years, and the imperial dream built upon this ideology. The Kremlin has never viewed Crimea as an equal part of Russia. For the Kremlin, Crimea has always been a strategic colony and a massive military base. The peninsula's natural resources, including water, and its infrastructure have always been exploited to serve Moscow's military and geopolitical objectives. The needs of the civilian population have always been secondary. The most brutal example of this colonial mentality is revealed by another fact uncovered by the Ukrainian National Resistance Center. Civilians working in Crimean shipyards are literally forced to work in slave-like conditions to repair Russian tanks and armored vehicles damaged in Ukraine. These people are either not paid at all, or are paid wages far below the minimum standard of living. Those who refuse are accused of non-cooperation and punished. This is a modern system of slavery in the 21st century, in the heart of Europe, and it sums up the real treatment that the Russian world has meted out to the people of Crimea. Under these conditions, the Kremlin's propaganda machine is in complete collapse. You cannot propagate stability or prosperity to a people who cannot get paid, who have no water running from their taps, who cannot find fuel for their cars, and who are forced to repair tanks. Putin's popularity in Crimea is evaporating rapidly, just like the water level in the reservoirs. As a result, Crimea, which Vladimir Putin presented in 2014 as a great victory and a shining jewel of the Russian world, has today become his greatest strategic burden, his bloodiest failure, and his most dangerous time bomb. By blowing up the Kakhovka Dam and scoring an own goal, the Kremlin has condemned the peninsula to irreversible drought, fuel shortages that paralyze the economy, and poverty that ensnares millions. The Belbek River, drying up for the first time since 1971, is not only an ecological disaster, but also a bitter symbol of the total failure of a decade-long occupation policy. The taps are empty. The reservoirs are empty. The pockets are empty. And most importantly, the Kremlin has no promises left to make to the people of Crimea. Crimea is no longer Russia's unsinkable aircraft carrier or impregnable fortress in the Black Sea. Crimea is a collapsed region, crushed under the wreckage of its own strategic mistakes, with 60,000 soldiers trapped in a logistical nightmare and 2.5 million civilians living on top of a social bomb ready to explode at any moment. Putin's promise of paradise in Crimea is gone. The reality that has taken its place is a self-suffocating frozen hell ruled by thirst, scarcity, misery, and growing anger. And the flames of this hell will sooner or later reach the gates of the Kremlin. So, what are your thoughts on this matter? Please share your thoughts in the comments. To stay updated on new videos, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to turn on notifications. Thank you for watching.